Hooray, recording is in progress. Awesome. Thanks everyone for being here. We're going to be talking about doing code reviews today. I'm pretty excited about this. There's been a lot of questions or sort of like apprehensions around like what does it mean to actually do a code review? So I feel like this would be really helpful, especially as we have like larger teams like we do with Vamos. Like just the volume of the code coming through makes it hard for senior devs like Ramiro or Tom and myself to do it all. So this is going to be really helpful going forward. At least for us at least, and I'm hoping it'll be helpful for you all. So yeah, let's get into it. Here's a title page. Pretty basic. This one. Okay, so the things we're going to be talking about today, a little bit of like why, like what are the benefits of doing code reviews, and we're going to be talking about most of the talk is going to be like what we're looking for when we do code reviews. I feel like that's going to be the most beneficial. Just sort of things to think about as you go through the code. There's a little bit towards the end of like the actual like mechanics of it, like how do I actually go about requesting a code review, submitting it, etc. Then the last page is resources. Sinan shared some really good resources a while ago, so that's sort of in there. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But yeah, any questions before you jump into it? All right, let's do it. All right, so y'all knew this was coming. A little bit of audience participation. Can anyone, would anyone mind sharing some of the benefits that we might get out of doing peer code reviews? So I think with a lot of the projects at Code the Dream, the model has been the apprentices, like you all will submit code reviews for one of the senior devs. So that's Tom, Ramiro, or myself. But at least for me, I've been on a kick to encourage a lot more peer code reviews. So, y'all can review each other's codes. Y'all can review each other's code. And that lines up much more closely with what the situation is going to be when you're out in the quote unquote real world, in a job, you're going to be reviewing the code of your peers and not sort of like, for the most part, submitting it to someone, in senior management. So yeah, and does anyone have any thoughts as to what might be beneficial about doing peer reviews?
I actually personally find doing the peer review, like for example, for myself, I am working like sometimes like one part of the application and with like some functions, but other people working the other part and there are some changes. Basically like when I review their code, I am having idea what's going on in the application and what is changing, and it gives me a better understanding about the project. And
yeah, totally. So just like being exposed to other parts of the code, so getting a wider understanding, right?
Crystal?
Yeah.
Yep. I think it's really good for collaboration because you begin looking at what each other are doing on the project so you can better work together going forward. Like you understand how each other works and what is clear for you versus what's clear for somebody else.
Totally. So it's like a tool of that sort of mutual learning kind of process, right?
Yeah. Personally, since I most of the time work by myself, I find that sometimes I have a bug and I can't find it. So it's good to have like extra, pair of eyes to like kind of like look through it with you. So they, or yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Cynthia, you have your hand up?
Yeah, actually, most of them they already indicated about that. But one of the beneficiaries of code peer review is sometimes when you are working for a ticket or tasks, you are focusing on to how that task is working. However, when the peer review, it's gonna be getting another cut for how the code is working related, because that ticket or that task may be related with the other component or the other
Mhm.
project parts. It may be affected to when you are looking for as a peer. So like just this happened for me as well. I'm getting for the information and helpful peer review, and still I'm working on my PR. So that is very helpful to working on as a peer.
Yeah, so you get the context from other parts of the code that people might be familiar with. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Um,
Narayan, how about
Narayan?
you? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking like when doing the peer review, it just reduces the burden on the senior devs or mentors like
That,
TC and
yeah,
Ramiro. Like,
that is true.
mhm.
Yeah. Let me see. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, so you all hit all the points basically. More eyes means more opportunities to find bugs, possible issues, makes code better. Continued mentorship and learning, better coordination. Yeah, totally all this for sure. I also put in here speeding up the code review cycle. So kind of talking to what Narayan was saying, like, unfortunately, like my time, Ramiro's time, Tom's time is pretty limited. So we're not able to get to reviews as often as we'd like. So I think oftentimes PRs end up sitting for longer than they should. So yeah, if y'all are reviewing each other's code, you'll get a quicker review, right? Quicker turnaround, which I think is better for everyone. And I think the bottom line for me is really it builds a sense of shared ownership. So like y'all are maintaining the code base as in an active way, right? So it's no longer just sort of like, oh, I'm going to like submit this for like approval or whatever, but sort of taking that initiative and saying like this is partly something that we are co-creating. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really valuable too. Well, let's move on. So that's sort of on the project base. So like what are reasons that you might want, specifically you, an individual person might want to submit a PR? Yeah.
You said, what are some of the reasons?
Yeah. Just like so you're working on some code, like what like for your own code or your own process, like what might be a reason you might want to put some code up for a PR? Aside from the obvious, right? Like,
Yeah. I always do PRs, even if I'm the only one working on it.
yeah.
Just because it allows me to double check that everything's looks good and I haven't included something I didn't mean to. Because
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it happens where you've accidentally brought over something or you mess something up on some other file, you didn't realize it. And you can
Totally.
do a nice comparison on GitHub to see the different files you changed and what, like Upstate, it creates a review app on Heroku so you can test it out functionality wise that it's working okay.
Yeah, I do the same thing. Even if I'm the only one on the project, I still like to me, it's like, it's comfortable. It's like, I do the review, I look at it. That diff is really, really important. Yeah, yeah. It's like Mary Alice, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just thinking, for collaborating, then it obviously makes good sense. I haven't really done a whole lot of PRs if I'm just working internally for myself, but I feel like for version control, it would be helpful if you are just working on something on yourself
Mhm.
and, to kind of do it to keep track of where you were with things at a given point.
Yeah, so you have that kind of that paper trail almost like in GitHub, right? So you can sort of go back through history and be like, oh, at this point we did that, I did this. Yeah, yeah. Anything else? We can kind of rush. We can go quickly through this. Yeah, so I have here invite collaboration, asking for comments. I think the first one is because we have to, right? That's kind of the obvious. there are some other reasons that I've put up PRs in the past. Sometimes I like just like stash something there to as a reminder of like, oh, I need to come back to this. So you can label it as like a work in progress. I think sometimes I'll put one up just to like have a place to ask the team, like, what do you think about this? You know, not necessarily because it's ready to be merged per se, but like I was thinking about doing like fixing this part of the code. I've done it this way. What do y'all think? You know, sort of like kind of preempting a conversation. That's been successful in the past. Sometimes if you're working with someone else in the same piece of code, you want to sort of like have them work off of your stuff. It's sometimes good to throw up a PR just so they can see the progress that you've made. Then they can take that branch and build off of it themselves. And there's the continuing to learn part. Yeah. I think I'm gonna.
There's one more.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
I had a computer crash, and like I lost everything, but because I had pushed my stuff to a repository, I was able to continue working on a new computer pretty quickly.
Totally.
Like having lost a bunch of work.
Yeah. I mean, I push my stuff pretty frequently, and like definitely at the end of the day, really make sure to push that up. Yeah. That's a good point. We still have a good amount to get through, so let's kind of hustle through the stuff. Reasons for why you might want to review a PR. So this is on the other side of like after a PR has been submitted, you're coming in as a reviewer. What are some reasons you might want to do the review? Like the first line is like looking for bugs and other issues, right? We talked about learning from your teammates, but you know, as you gain more experience, there might be other reasons to do a review as well. Oftentimes, there'll be a part of the code that you know or you're more familiar with than other people, so you might be able to be the subject matter expert for that part of the code. So you might be able to lend your experience in that way. You know, if you're interested in maintaining the readability of the code, that's something you can sort of like take the initiative on as well. Suggesting other ways of accomplishing the task. Another one is just like asking questions, you know, like looking at, I think one thing that's really valuable is reviewing, just a bit going through the PRs that are up and just sort of like briefly browsing through them just to like get a feel for like the changes that people are proposing. Just so you have kind of a baseline understanding of like where things are going. And that helps to sort of build up that overall context for your understanding of the code base. And also like there's a reciprocality, right? So like the more you're perceived as someone who does reviews, I think people will end up becoming more likely to do reviews for you in turn. You know, so there's a kind of like you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of thing that kind of happens. So yeah, those are all kind of valid reasons, not valid, but just like reasons for wanting to do PR. Let's move on. The main thing at this point I want to reiterate is you do not need to be an expert to review someone else's code. And this is so important that I put it here twice in the slide. I'm gonna say it again. You do not need to be an expert to review someone else's code. I think that's been the biggest blocker, I feel like, is sort of the imposter syndrome of feeling like, oh, I don't know enough, like I'm just starting out. Code reviews are like a, I was going to say an all ages experience, not just all ages, but you know, even if you're just starting out, you know, there's always a place for you, you know, even if it's just like pointing out grammar mistakes or typos, you know, like anything you can do to help contribute to the team is really, really valuable. So once again, you don't need to be an expert. Yeah, let's move on. So we're getting into the sort of the how section now. So this is going to be, apologies, a lot of like text on screen, which is not my favorite way of doing slideshows, but I think with this kind of stuff, it's kind of unavoidable. So let's get through it. Yeah. So when we're actually doing a PR, there are a number of things before even looking at the code itself that you can sort of like start asking yourself. One thing that is really, really helpful when you're reviewing a PR is getting an understanding of the context, or what is this actually intending to do? So at least on the projects that I'm on, we have a PR template that includes two sections. There's the description of the ticket and then some background information. So, if you read through that stuff, does that actually help explain what's happening here, or do you need to have more information? If so, you can go back to the person, just ask them, hey, can you put some more information in here? I don't quite understand what's happening. I think that's really, really helpful sometimes, especially if it's like removing code and it's not very clear like why it's being removed, or like, sometimes if you remove code, there'll be code somewhere else that depends on that code, right? So it's really helpful to know like why, A, why it's being removed, and B, knowing that there are provisions in place so that things don't break after this code's been removed, Yeah, another question to ask yourself is this part of the code that I'm familiar with? If so, like that might be something you can help contribute with, sort of just being able to, like I said before, so bring the experience that you've had with that code. Or if not, maybe this is something I want to learn about. So that'd be an opportunity to sort of get more information about what's happening. Oh yeah, so is there anything here I can learn from? So maybe it's not just about sort of the area of the code itself, but also just like the techniques that they're using. Are there, if they're more advanced, like there might be something that you might be able to pick up from them. Conversely, if it's someone who's more junior, you might be able to lend some of that understanding as well. One of the biggest things that we look at with doing PRs is what are called code smells. It's kind of a funny term, but basically like it's kind of developing a spidey sense for potential issues with code. We'll get into a lot of different variants of code smells, but basically like just like following your intuition and sort of seeking down things that might not be fully kosher. It's kind of hard to describe, but really like if something feels suspicious to you, like follow that, sort of activate that curiosity. We'll talk more about that in a bit. There's another term called technical debt, which we'll get into as well. But basically the idea is anytime you're writing code, that code is situated in time and space, and sort of like the current status of that project. You write it, it gets put into the code base, it's like there. At some point later on down the road, as you continue to add code, oftentimes it becomes apparent that like the code that you wrote at some point in the past no longer accomplishes what you needed to do, right? Maybe there's like been an update to the product specs, or maybe APIs change, libraries get out of date, so you need to go back through and sort of like update that code. The term technical debt is used to describe that kind of like work that needs to be done after the fact, to sort of bring things up to speed. So it's another one of those terms that's like kind of squishy, but yeah, that's something to look out for as well. And we have another slide later on to talk more about technical debt. Another question to ask is there someone else who should be looking at this code? So I might not be an expert on React or Elasticsearch or like Postgres or whatever, but is there someone else on the team who it would be beneficial to have look at? Someone who might be more an expert on one of those technologies or subjects. So maybe sort of like, hey, would you mind looking at this? So these are all like things to fix. But I also want to include here at the bottom, what can I celebrate here? Part of the doing peer reviews is so building up that team camaraderie, right? So is there anything like, yeah, so if you see something that's like kind of cool, like shout that out, be like, hey, this is awesome. Thanks for doing this, whatever the case may be. It's nice to have little pops of appreciation to sort of help lighten the load. Yeah. So that's kind of the list here so far. What do I have next? Oh yeah, we're going straight into the code smells, I think. For people who've been doing reviews, is there anything else you want to add here as well? Or should we move on? Yeah, okay. All right, let's move on to code smells. So like I said, these are things that sort of like, it's like little whiffs in the air that's like, maybe there's something else going on here. So the first one is kind of an overall sort of like circling the fence kind of thing. First off, can I read this code? John was here, had just mentioned the previous meeting, I think the first task with doing a code review is just understanding the code. If you can't read the code, then you can't review it, right? So the first order of business is like, can I actually even read this code? Can I understand what's happening? If I'm not, then there's probably a likelihood that like other people in the team aren't going to be able to read it either, which means that if I or someone else comes back to like work on this code later, it's going to make it really hard for the whole team, right? So that's something to look out for. I tend to be a pretty big stickler on style, and we're working to put things like ESLint, like automated linting and whatnot in place. But that's sometimes the first thing I'll look at is just like, is this formatted in a way that makes it really hard to read? So yeah, I think that just helps overall. Other things to look at, should this function class component be broken down into small units? I feel like this is, especially when you're starting out, this is kind of a one of those things that comes with time, is getting a feeling for like when a function or a class is too big and could be split into smaller functions or classes. I think especially with some of our React projects, we have these massive components. And it's most of the time, I'm not gonna say all the time, but definitely most of the time, it's more manageable to have smaller pieces that you can sort of maintain on their own rather than having one giant massive thing, so that's something to look at. Conversely, sometimes you might go too far in the other direction and have way too many like individual use cases. So sometimes it might be useful to like consolidate things, or if you bring things together in a certain way, that might simplify a lot of like the underlying complexity. Yeah. Another one of the things I'm always looking out for is extraneous console.logs or bybugs. It's less so with bybugs because it's more clear. It's noisier, I guess. But console logs are a constant battle. I know they're useful, especially basically like when you're doing React or JavaScript programming, it's that you kind of need to have them, But if you have a bunch of console logs embedded throughout your code base, that's going to be spitting out stuff into console all the time. So then that becomes way more noise than signal. So that's not very helpful, I think, for development. Because if you can just console log the thing that you need, you know that the thing that's being spit out the console is the thing that you need, right? So that's on like the local development level, but also it's a potential security risk as well. So like if you're console logging, say like authentication information in your app, especially if it's like a web React project, you could be exposing sensitive information just to anyone who happens to open the console in the browser, So the less actual data that isn't formatted in the way you want, the better. So I'll usually take a pass and just sort of like strike out as many console log. Anytime I see a console log that isn't necessary, I'm gonna point that out. Comments are another common thing. Commented out code. I think that's another like common thing of like, well, like I'm not sure if I can remove this, or like this is code that I'm not really comfortable with. So I'm just gonna comment it out, so it's not gonna run. Which might be cool at the moment, but then like you come back after X amount of time, and it becomes really unclear like what is the intention here, so anytime you have commented out code, another sort of fear is like, oh, if I remove it, like it's going to be gone forever. But I mean, that's kind of the point of version control, is like you can always go back to the history of a file and like find, if you really need to go back and like reinstate some previous code, you can always find that by going through the history. So yeah, anytime you're commenting out code, that's another code spell of like, well, let me see what's going on here. And unless it's like for a very specific reason, like oftentimes we'll get to it, but if you're building out a larger product and you don't want to give the user access to it initially, you might want to comment stuff out temporarily, so it's not being exposed. But then, that allows you to still work with it locally, so you can uncomment it and work with it as you develop. So that's like one exception to that rule that I allow myself. To-do comments are sometimes good. So like if like the change that you've done is a smaller part of a larger refactor that needs to happen, sometimes we put in a to-do comment to be like, okay, we need to come back to do X here. So that's good. But oftentimes there's a lot of comments that are kind of redundant, that like if you have really readable code, there's not really a need for a comment, right? So one of the questions that I ask myself is like, can we rename these functions, these variables, et cetera, to be self-documenting? So they're very clear what's happening here, so that like there is no need to have comment on top of it. So instead of saying like contact, as a variable, you could call it like contact to be displayed, or something like that. So can we be more specific about the way we name things? Another one is like, are the files in the right place? Is there any renaming that need to be done? With React, you can sort of import files as different names. But if you're calling it something in one place, you should have that name be applied somewhere else, right? So are things consistent in that kind of way? And lastly, like any opportunities to refactor old code. So oftentimes we'll make a change, but then like you realize, oh, this is connected to like all this other stuff that needs to be changed as well. But like I don't really have the bandwidth to do that now. That's not part of the ticket. That's fine. But like you can maybe, like I said, go back to do a to-do comment. You can talk about that at daily stand-up. You can make another ticket for it. Yeah. I think this comes with also knowing parts of the code base. Like if you, the reviewer, know more about sort of like the area of this code, maybe you can say like, oh, this it would be better to do this, but we can't do it right now. So let's make a separate ticket for it. Yeah. Any questions about this? I know I'm kind of like rushing through it, but there's a lot of stuff in this the slideshow. Okay, all right, let's move on. Implementation details. So this is kind of zooming in a little bit more to the code itself. So the previous one was more about sort of overall, just like general practices. So I've duplicated the renaming thing here. Can things be renamed so we don't need extra comments? Another one is like, is this duplicating code that already exists? Or maybe not, it might not duplicate the code exactly, but maybe there's a different way of doing this that was already built that the developer wasn't aware of. Or just kind of like, yeah, I guess, yeah, just didn't know it was there. And if you know about something like that, then like jump in and be like, oh, hey, actually, I see you doing this, but there's this other way that we've already built that like could do it in a better way, or whatever the case may be. Yeah. Like would the code unnecessarily complicate things? So going back to that refactor question, are they going about in a way that like makes things more complicated than they should be? That's another one of those things that come with time. Related to that, is there some piece of technology that we could put in place to do this for us? Oftentimes it's quicker. I'm not gonna say quicker, but like more efficient to kind of that's a bad analogy, but like offshore things to libraries that have already been built that are part of the open source community that can do things for us rather than like try to build it ourselves. Conversely, is there a framework that we're using that is being problematic, or honestly, it's something that wouldn't be that much of a lift that we could do ourselves. When you're using external libraries, there is some overhead, right? It's not cost free. Like one of the biggest things is like you're kind of beholden to the pace of change that they determine in the open source project. So sometimes it might be a change that needs to happen. You can put in a PR on that third-party library to like have a change be done, but like there's no guarantee that it's actually going to be reviewed and committed and released with the next version, right? So I've run into the situation in other projects where we need a change to happen in a third-party library. So we'll submit the PR, but we need it now. So like, I guess we'll clone it and roll our own version of the library. So, we'll do an NPM package, all that stuff. But then it becomes kind of a hassle of like making sure that clone that you've made is kept up to date with the original library. It becomes kind of a nightmare. So oftentimes, like if you run into a situation like that, maybe it's better to just like do it ourselves. And I think we've reached that conclusion with one of the libraries in the mobile app for Vamos. We had been using a library to set up the dynamic forms for us, but it's become clear in a number of different ways that is not the best way to approach things. And so we're actually working right now to replicate that functionality on our own because it's just going to be a better experience all around. So those two questions: should we use a piece of third-party tech, or should we not? Another big one is other best practices or design patterns that might be of use here. I don't think we've really covered design patterns. I think that's more of an advanced topic. Basically, are there any techniques that you've built up knowledge about over your time as a developer that could be of use to the developer who made the review or the PR? And then, there's also the performance piece. So depending on how you do database queries, it might not be obvious that there might be performance hits that come with a certain change. So are there ways that you can sort of tweak things to make them more performant? Yeah. Questions on any of this? Let me know if y'all need a break, because I'm just like rabbiting on. And next section, potential bugs. Another big thing to look at is like, are there likely to be bugs that come as part of this change? Are there any things that I can see just from the code itself that like, oh, this might be an issue? And going back to kind of what John was saying, also, does the PR actually do what it says it's going to do? Like sort of the happy path. So like, usually when you develop against a ticket, you're looking to provide a certain functionality, right? So does a ticket actually make sure that functionality happens? Because if not, then like you're not fulfilling the goals of the ticket. So something needs to be done. Something needs to be fixed. in addition to that happy path, there's always going to be things that lie outside of what the initial intention is. And those are called edge cases. And, like a really seasoned developer will be able to sort of count for a lot of these edge cases as they work. But sometimes, oftentimes it's not obvious, like what might be an edge case. So like an example of edge case, let's say like you have an input, right? And you expect that to be, it's just going to be a string of some kind. There's the classic case of SQL injection attacks or JavaScript injection attacks where, you're expecting just to have a string. What if someone actually puts some JavaScript in there or puts some SQL into that input? What happens? If you're not sanitizing it, if you're not validating it, that's a classic vulnerability. So, just like things to consider. We'll talk about security later. But yeah, what are things that lie outside of like the main sort of thing you're building towards that might happen? And I think, like I said, like that's, especially when you're like in the work mode of like, I got to make this thing happen. That's a lot of times it's easy to let that stuff kind of go by the wayside. So that's one of the real benefits of doing peer reviews is having those fresh eyes, and just thinking like, what if I put an emoji in here? What if I had the things that weren't the right encoding? What if we had a null value in the database? What if we had a different value than what we're parsing for? Just thinking through those kind of things. Another big thing to account for is API and front-end work. Those two can be very coupled. So if you're making a change to an API, better make sure that the front end that is consuming the API is still going to continue to work, right? And vice versa. So if you're making a change to the front end, so the back end should be, you should make sure to work with the back end to make sure that it's going to work, and if that isn't set up already, then, maybe we should make more tickets to make sure that we account for that code dependency. Yeah. Kind of relatedly, is there adequate error handling? What happens if we throw an exception somewhere? Like how is it handled? I also included testing here, but that should honestly be its own section. Are there tests at all? If you're on a project that does testing, which we need to be moving towards. It's difficult with front end stuff, but we're working away there. But yeah, are there tests at all? Are the tests appropriate to the actual task? Adriana, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question regarding the test because I have been working lately with RSpecs, and my question here is, I put a test for the application for for the login. My question is this redundant that you also test the controller, the login on each part, or it's okay just to have it? Like, for example, when you do the post, you check if the user is not logging. The test will fail. But is this considered redundant, or as much as you can test is better? So that's my main question for you, that you are the junior.
When you say like what, so you're testing,
for example,
go ahead.
For example, I'm testing it on the application. I'm testing when the user is logging and when the user is not logging. And later I go to the controller, for example, the courses controller, and I set up a test when the user is not logging. He cannot do a post, or he cannot do delete or any of the CRUD operations, right? So if we already test the login on the application, is this considered redundant, or it's okay to have as much as examples as you can?
It's actually, I think it's a little bit dependent project, but I don't think it's a bad thing to have overlapping tests necessarily. Sometimes it feels like it can be redundant, but in that, I guess it sounds like in this case, you're testing specifically. Yeah, there's different categories of tests, right? There's like more unit tests where like you're testing a piece of something. So maybe you're testing specifically the endpoint. And then there's kind of more of an integration test where you're loading up like a mock client or mock server, and you're actually running through like loading the actual request, that sort of thing. It's not, I don't think it's a bad thing to have both. But I think it, like I said, it kind of depends on the specifics. And that also might be a decision that you make as a team, you know, just dependent on what the situation is. Yeah, because I'm not quite familiar with the project, so I can't say for sure. But
well,
yeah.
If I can just comment,
Sure.
The concern here
Oh,
is
John.
somebody could have the logon working just fine, but then they forget to put security in their controller.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden you can do all sorts of operations without being logged in. Or all of a sudden you can do operations being logged in as somebody who's not authorized to do that particular operation.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some overlap in the controller to actually see that the security is present. It might not be exhaustive. Otherwise, you'd have to write a test case for each operation that says, do you have to be logged in? Do you have to be authorized? And so on. To do that for every operation is probably excessive, but to do that for a couple of operations is probably required and appropriate.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's also the difference between authentication and authorization. So authentication is the actual login flow, and authorization is the part where you're being blocked from things that should be blocked from. Yeah, so I think both should definitely be tested. Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like that's kind of what we're talking about here. Yeah, okay, yeah. And especially if there are things that you really don't want users of a certain level to see, then they should definitely make sure to test that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment on this slide. Do the changes in the PR accomplish what they are meant to? That actually is not so easy to do. Now, one of the things we can do is have reasonably comprehensive tests automation. And for the back end, when it is based on Rails, we use RSpec. Unfortunately, we do not have an automated test procedure for the front end, which has led to quality problems and regressions in the front end. So long as we don't have an automated test procedure for the front end, there needs to be an alternate procedure where the code reviewer can verify that the changes in the PR accomplish what they're meant to, because you can't do that just by eyeballing the code. I don't think any expert can do that. So, for example, you document the manual tests that you would do for the front end to see that the changes in the PR accomplish what they're meant to. And I think it's important that we do that, and to the extent that it's not done, that we start doing that. Similarly, the back end, where we do have an automated test procedure, if a PR doesn't include tests, it should not be approved.
Yeah.
Do you need tests for automated front-end tests for React?
Yeah.
Right now, we don't have an automated front-end test framework, and that would be for both React and JavaScript. And
I use Capybara for the front end of Upstate.
Yeah, for most other projects, we don't have a framework in place. So yeah, if you do have it in place, that should be something you're looking for. for the ones that I'm on, there's a section of the PR template specifically for testing steps to reproduce the functionality. Yeah, so that's there, but it's only useful if people fill it out. Yeah.
Right, and
yeah.
the PR process, then, the reviewer should plan to download the changed code and try it out.
Yeah.
Um,
That's honestly, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I will say something else later.
Okay, okay. The few peer reviews that I've seen with at least Fama's front end, that's been sort of like what people have been doing. More than like looking at the code is like pulling it and running it. So I'm glad to see that. But yeah, I think what we could do is be more consistent about filling out those steps. We also, with Famos, we have Michael Durbin, who originated the project. We started to have him start to do QA on the app. We're still figuring out what the best schedule would be, but yeah, we're looking to build that process out as well. So basically, QA is quality assurance. It's sort of like taking all of the steps that you built up over time, and sometimes you have to reduce it down to the critical path. But yeah, just making sure like the things that you want to ensure continue to operate as designed. And like John said, like we have not had any notion of that in the past. So we are moving to implement that as well, at least in Vamos, because there have been so many issues. Adriana?
Yeah, I have another comment because when I was working with John in the practicum, we noticed that when we inspect something for the GPS, like geolocation on the API, you can see the key on the API. So somebody else can see the key, copy and paste. So that's part of the security on the APIs.
Yeah.
API, they will charge to GoTheDream for that service. So those are open gates for all the projects. So
totally,
we need to check the API security because we noticed that on the practicum with John.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I just want to mention that is another gate to open.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, I think I have a separate slide that includes that. But yeah, thank you for definitely mentioning it. Yeah, I mean, security is a whole other conversation for sure. Yeah, anytime you're exposing keys, like that's a bad thing. Yeah.
Regarding the security, I also want to know if there is some audit that GoTheDream do to their projects, because I remember there is auditors that say, okay, they do a service and they check all the projects and they say, okay, you have these vulnerabilities, so you need to close these gates in order that you don't have a crash.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to mention, if GoTheDream has something like that.
We don't have something like that set up right now. That's something that I want to do as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Those are the things that I want to mention when I listen to the conversation regarding the gates that are open.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think security, that's its own set of Huddle topics that we could do. Thank you for pointing that out. But yeah, that's a conversation we need to have on its own terms as well. We are burning through time pretty quickly, so I'm going to get through as much as I can. We might have to split this to the next week, maybe. So yeah, so let's see what we can get through now. Another thing to look at is deployment issues, especially around migrations. This is another classic gotcha, is having data in the database that doesn't work with the existing code after you do a migration. So usually with deployment, there's kind of three phases to it. There's the existing stuff as it is now. So it's pre-migration, pre-deployment of the new code. So it's like what's currently running. You'll run the migration, or the sequence of this might be flipped, but usually the case is you run the migration, that'll set up the database for whatever's coming later. But after that migration's done, until you have the new box up and running, there's a period of time where you have the new data structure, but you're running on the old code. And depending on how live your app is, if there's an issue where those two don't work together, that might bring your app down, or people might have unexpected experiences. So until you have the new code deployed, there's a possibility that things might break. And obviously, after the new code is up, then if if the issue itself, if the PR itself is good, then that should work, right? But this is definitely something that we should be looking at. Is the new data structure going to work with the old code and the new code? Make sure to be able to handle both. So one thing to ask is, is the old code going to work with this new data structure? And if not, should we look at maybe doing this in 2 separate deployments? Should we have some code update that makes the old code able to handle the new structure before we do the actual deployment itself? There are ways to. If you want more information about this, we can talk about that. But even aside from like this sequencing kind of issue, one thing that I've noticed is oftentimes we don't really take account of historical data in the database. So, so you're working happily in your local environment with data that you're expecting. So if it's like a Boolean field, like it's just like yes, no. What happens if you run that migration on production and there's something totally outside of the bounds of that yes, no, right? How do you handle that? Especially for backend folks, this is really important. Making sure you handle the historical data appropriately. And I think this is another one of those like case-to-case issues where really depends on what the particulars of the situation are, kind of drives what the right approach would be. But this is like going back to this is like questions to be running through your head as you're doing the review. Any comments on this? Okay, all right, let's move on. Security, here we go, here's security. So we talked about potential code injection of cross-site scripting attack vectors, unsanitized inputs. Is this handling sensitive data? Should it be encrypted if not already? If displaying interpolated variables and strings, is it possible that we're exposing sensitive data? So this kind of goes along the lines of what you're saying, Adriana, about exposing keys accidentally. Other obsolete libraries that we're using that might have vulnerabilities. Luckily we do have the whatever it is, that bot that makes sure to alert you of updated or library updates. So we should be updating those as soon as we find them. If there is new CRUD functionality, are we granting the right access levels to appropriate user levels? And like John mentioned, making sure we actually test against that. Are we doing any homegrown encryption or authentication? Encryption is difficult. And for the most part, you shouldn't be writing your own encryption algorithms. There are libraries out there to do that for you. Because it's really easy to do things wrong and create an attack vector for yourself. So that's something to look out for. And then, once again, are we exposing extraneous information unnecessarily? I think the last one I had here was the UX usability piece. I wanted to leave room for questions, but I'm not going to get to. So maybe, I'll talk with Lydia about extending this next week as well.
We already we have you down for next week for
That's true.
Redux. So I don't
That's
know if
true.
you want to integrate it at the beginning.
Yeah, 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 I'll probably end up doing that. Yeah, thanks, Alex. But yeah, real quickly, is a product actually functional? And like John said, you might need to actually pull it to run it and see, like, does it actually do what it says it does? Like, how much consideration has the developer given to the actual end user's experience? What about accessibility? You know, do we have labels? Do we have alt tags? Does navigation make sense? Do color choices make sense? I know, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. How is the interface? This is a big one. How consistent is it with the existing design? And then what I want to put in here is there any like copy that needs to be cleaned up? There's a lot more to go into here. But this is just like the first gloss of it. Yeah. So unfortunately, we're out of time. But yeah, so I'll work with Alex and Lydia to get the next part of this presentation done next week. Yeah, I'm going to end with this slide. This is a skill that you will continue to develop, like any other skill in coding or life. Yeah, so, and I just threw a bunch of stuff at you, and so don't expect to like be able to do all of that. These are just like things to keep in mind as you grow in your coding journey. But unfortunately, I have to run. I have a external meeting I have to go to, but thank you all for being here. And I guess I hate to do this, but if you have questions, let's go through them next week.